Hi there, my name is Lucas Weiss, and I am the host of the Weesesports Quarantine Chronicles. For today's episode, I'm joined by Brock Otten, the founder of OHL Prospects and a contributor to McKeen's Hockey. In this episode, I chat with Brock about how he got into junior hockey, evaluating prospects, and his advice for young hockey writers looking to break into the industry. The Weesports Quarantine Chronicles is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. Now let's get to episode 57 with Brock Otten on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles. All right, on today's episode of the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles, I'm joined by Brock Otten. He is not only a physical educator and a Blue Jays fan, as we see from his clothing and apparel, but he is the man behind OHL Prospects, a contributor to McKeen's Hockey, and a staple of Prospects Twitter. Brock, welcome to the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles.
Thanks for having me.
Well, listen, I mean, you've been very busy lately with your very long and detailed prospect list in preparation for the 2020 NHL draft, but before we get into it, maybe we could just start by, you and what made you want to get involved in covering hockey prospects.
So when I was in late high school, I was trying to decide, do I want to be a teacher or do I want to be a journalist? So I was kind of weighing the options. What I started to do towards the end of high school, grade 11, grade 12, was build a portfolio like everybody who's going to apply to journalism school. So what helped me do that was I got a job at Hockey's Future, the now defunct Hockey's Future. And that was to cover OHL and Toronto Maple Leafs prospects. So got to go to a lot of OHL games and then meet people and make connections and kind of developed a passion for junior hockey from doing that. Ultimately decided to go the route of being a teacher just for job security and for various other reasons. But while I was in school, that was when the Mississauga Ice Dogs moved to Niagara. So it was a stone's throw away. So I was still going to games and realized that, I still had some connection and still had a passion for writing. So kind of started it up as a side project to continue writing. And, it's blossomed into what it has today and has allowed me to continue to teach and do what I love there, but also continue to write, which is another passion of mine.
So how is your job with OHL Prospects now and, your work with, McKeen's Hockey compared to when you were first starting out?
That's a good question. When I first started out, I didn't really know sort of what route I wanted to take it. So I was kind of doing a lot of different things on the blog, be it, individual game reports or, player features, player interviews. In recent years, it's kind of, I want to say that there's been less content, but more focused content, more towards focusing on the draft and the prospects themselves and not just covering the OHL. And then latching on with McKeen's, the last 2 or 3 years, it has been great to continue to build what I like to do and to give me another voice to do it. And they put out such a great product as well. And it's been a pleasure to write for them and also continue my work on OHL Prospects.
Well, I think you made a really interesting point because I think that when you look at, people trying to get into sports media, I think junior hockey is a great opportunity. I know it's, currently is for me to get reps in and, to really, cover a sport that you really love. But I think you make a good point about how, you sort of morph into the more focused content. And I think a lot for young journalists, it's a lot of trial and error, to figure out, okay, I have the experience to be writing game reports, but then, is my audience, maybe they're not really interested in that. And then you maybe morph into, okay, let's write more feature profiles on the prospects. That gets more attention, but then maybe you then morph into actually like scouting and that gets more attention. So it's an interesting sort of path for you to sort of see, okay, trying different things and figuring out what sticks with you and your target audience.
Absolutely. I think you nailed it there. Over the years, I think the one thing that I've noticed is, the individual player reports and game reports are great. But in terms of an audience, they don't bring in as much as, say, rankings or discussions, about the higher end players in the OHL or player features. The thing that I've added in recent years, a lot of collaborative projects, with different scouts and different media members. Those are the things that people really are interested in the most anyway. So that's kind of where I've tried to focus a lot of my attention.
Well, I think you mentioned collaborating with different media members, and I think like that's what's so unique about prospects Twitter and just covering prospects in general is I find like, look, in other sports, it's ultra competitive, right? And that makes sense. Professional hockey or other sports, media members, they while they're covering the beat, they're also representing a company, and there's a lot of obligations to break the story first and get the story that no one else has. And I think it's the same probably way in junior hockey, but given your experience with working with other media members, it's nice to see the collaboration in terms of collaborating ideas and content when it comes to ranking prospects.
I think the biggest difference between, say, covering junior hockey and prospects for the NHL versus, say, covering the MLB or covering the NBA or covering college sports is that the media coverage for the CHL, as an example, or even junior hockey across the world, it's not as much in the spotlight. So it's kind of harder to find somebody who really understands all of it, if that makes sense. Like there are guys like Corey Proman at The Athletic and Scott Wheeler at The Athletic and Chris Peters at ESPN. There are guys who managed to do a really good job of covering players from around the globe. But you also have little pockets, guys like myself covering the OHL. You have guys out west. You have guys, covering the Q. You have guys who are specific to the USHL. You have guys that are specific to Europe. So it's always good to sort of talk to each other and continue to bounce ideas off each other. And not just that, but, reflect on some of the things that maybe you've seen. And I think that's sort of the thing that makes, that sort of bubble of junior coverage that you've talked about so interesting is, that is something that we do quite often. If I see a game and I see a particular player, I might send a text or a DM to another guy that I trust who might have seen that player recently and say, hey, this is what I'm seeing. Are you seeing something similar the last time that you saw them? And we sort of bounce ideas off each other. And I think that's a good thing, is it ultimately makes the coverage better because everybody's sort of working on their own timeline, but working as a cohesive unit as well.
And building off of that, does that mean that like your process of scouting and evaluating players has evolved over the years?
Oh, 100%. I think you build sort of a bubble of people that you trust their opinion, and you're not afraid to ask them for that opinion as well. Ultimately, your own eyes are great, but there are things that you're not going to catch. And not just that, but, because of how regional it is, there's some teams that I see more often than others. Based out of the GTA, I'm at a lot of Steelheads games when I don't want to travel. So I see them a lot more often than other OHL teams, as an example. So I might have people who ask me my opinion about certain players on that team because they know that I've seen them a fair amount. Just the same, I might not see some of the teams in the States as much as I'd like. So, I might reach out to somebody who's based out of London or based out of Windsor, who makes that trek across to Saginaw, to Erie, or to, even if we're talking about the USHL and players who are coming into the OHL from USHL, which happens every year, getting an opinion on them as well. Like I said, it's a network, right? And yeah, I think it's safe to say that the way that I approach things has definitely evolved over the years. I think it's evolved for everybody. I think, the amount of video scouting that's available as well, and how open the sort of open source the material is now as well is making things different and making things easier, to be honest.
So it's the regular season, and of course, for anyone who follows junior hockey knows, goes from about September to March. Playoffs are in April. The Memorial Cup is in May for an OHL team, and then you have the June is normally the 2020 NHL draft. Of course, there's other leagues as well, the GTHL, among others. So, in a given week, Brock, like how many games do you go to covering and evaluating prospects?
Yeah, it's a good question. It really depends on the week, and it depends on the time of the year. There are certain times where my own profession as a teacher, times are busy. We get coaching, which I do a lot myself. So, I might go a couple weeks where I don't go see a game live, and instead I'm watching games on video. And then there might be a weekend where I go see 2 games in one weekend to catch up. And it depends on what teams are in town too. Maybe the West is visiting Mississauga, or they're in Niagara, and it's an opportunity for me to go see some teams that I haven't seen. So, I make sure that I'm going to those games to get a good live look at a player that maybe I haven't seen quite as much live as I'd like. And looking at something like the GTHL as well. I'm not somebody who goes to the regular season games. I'll go to some of the major tournaments. I'm always at the OHL Cup watching, at the very least, the quarters, semis, and the final. I usually go to one of the earlier tournaments in the year too, be it maybe the Marlborough's Classic, or I've never been to the Battle of the Border, but that's one that I've wanted to go to in recent years. So the major tournaments for scouting the minor midget kids. Otherwise, I'm just looking at or talking to people who do that sort of on a more consistent basis. So I would say probably on average, like 1 game a week, maybe 1 game every 2 weeks, depending on what my schedule is like, and then watching a lot of games on video and clips and combining the two. And I think that's something that sort of evolved with my coverage in recent years too, is trusting sort of video coverage as just as much as live, because I think there's some really good things that can come from both. I think if you're just watching video, I don't think you're getting the complete picture. And if you're just watching live, there's some things that you're missing and you're not able to sort of go back on.
And for a particular player, like how many, games or clips do you need to watch of a certain guy to really get a sense of who they are and what they bring to the table from their hockey skill perspective?
That's a really good question. I really think it depends on the player too. There's certain players, we talked about, going to tournaments for a minor midget. There are certain guys that I have a really good grasp on because, I watched them in a few tournaments. I saw maybe 6 or 7 of their games in minor midget from tournaments. And then, you watch them in their original year, in their rookie season in the OHL. And then you're watching the next year in their draft year, or even you're watching them if they're a later birthday for 3 seasons in the OHL. And you've got a pretty good idea of the type of player they are. So, you might not need as many views, where there are other guys, who are a lot more difficult to scout. It really just depends. Especially when you're looking at a team like London. London can sometimes be tricky because, a lot of their draft eligible players have to work their way up the lineup. So you might not see them very much, when you go to watch them as a rookie. They're playing 4th line minutes. They're not playing very much. They might see the ice maybe a couple shifts every period. And they go into their draft year and they're still buried on the 3rd or 4th line. A guy like Antonio Stranges in London is a perfect example of that. He still played on the 3rd or 4th line this year. You're seeing him still ranked for, the 3rd or 4th round this year, but he can be a tough guy to really get a read on if you're going to watch him and you're not seeing him play very much, right? There's other guys who, you feel pretty comfortable. Okay, I've watched this guy 3 times, all 3 times, play the exact same way. I think I've got a pretty good understanding of what he brings to the table. You might see another player 3 times, and every time you see them, they play differently. So the inconsistencies of junior hockey can make it difficult. So it really just depends on the situation. It depends on the player. It's hard to sort of nail down that way.
Well, and the point that you make about inconsistencies, it's so true, and it probably leads to a lot of sometimes variability among scouts and people that rank prospects, right? Because if you like you said, like if you see a guy a certain way, the eye test, and then, you analyze them this way, maybe analytics wise and whatnot. Like you may lead to more variation in terms of, ranking and, deciphering one prospect from the other.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of times too, and pretty much every guy that is doing this right now, or every person that's doing this right now, will tell you that, you look at something, maybe a ranking from somebody else that you trust, and they've got a player ranked relatively high that you're not really seeing eye to eye with. Sometimes that makes you go back and reevaluate and rewatch and look at some of the things that they're saying about the player. And you might rewatch and say, hey, yeah, I miss this. Maybe the 3 or 4 times that I've seen this player live, or 3 or 4 times that I've seen this player in general this year, that was their 3 or 4 worst games of the season. So, okay, I've missed this person. I need to go back and I need to rewatch, a couple games that maybe give a better idea of that player's potential or their ability. So it's not an exact science. And I think you have to accept the fact that you're not going to be perfect in an evaluation. I think you have to accept the fact that, your word isn't gospel, that, you can look at some of the other things that are happening in terms of coverage and reflect on your own rankings and say, maybe I'm missing something, or maybe I'm overrating this person. And I think the more you do this too, the more you see maybe there are certain qualities that you overrate as an evaluator, or that you underrate as an evaluator. For me, I'm always a sucker for sort of that throwback player. That's always something that I finding myself gravitating towards, especially that forward who plays a rugged game, brings some size, brings some goal scoring ability, and the game has changed so much. And I think you need to be careful and looking at your own personal biases and trying to separate those as well, and trying to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, and it just goes back to how you evaluate and your evolution as an evaluator. I think, if you're not going to be willing to adapt to the trends of the game and the trends of evaluation, then you're just going to be left behind, because people are then going to be more gravitating towards people that are more up to date in terms of evaluating. I think, like, it's always a process, right? Like to see how you can be better and to evaluate yourself on how you can be better, looking at prospects.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think, that's sort of where my background as an educator comes in. And it's something that you always have to do as an educator, is constantly reflect on the things that you're doing and try to think about ways that you can do it better. And scouting players and writing about junior hockey, I think it's the same. And, you look at how much advanced stats and how much analytics are out there now, and finding ways to understand those things better so that you can incorporate them into your own evaluations. I think that's super important. And 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there might be different things out there that you have to continue to incorporate and continue to evolve.
So do you have a list before each season of guys that, like, you're targeting to look at and to build sort of a case for in terms of what they bring to the table? And then what do you do about guys that, like, weren't on your, like, preseason list, like, and then pop up? Like, are you then quick to, like, gravitate and say towards them, or are you more willing to just sort of wait and see about a guy that surprises in a particular season?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I definitely have a list at the beginning of the year. So I always release a list that sort of makes it known the players that I'm ready to watch as draft eligibles going into the season. That always drops around late August. So, even before the regular season starts. And then you're just consistently, altering or adding to that as you watch players play. And I think you sort of brought up an interesting point, and that is how quickly you might add somebody who is new to the league or, has really progressed well as a player. I think of a guy like Zayd Wisdom this year in Kingston. I think he's a perfect example. There's a guy who played a fourth line role in Kingston last year as a rookie in the league. There were definitely some standout qualities. He was a player that I mentioned as an honorable mention in my August list. And then, over the course of the year, okay, you watch him early. I saw Kingston really early in the year, and I said, whoa, okay, so this guy's definitely made some improvements to his game. Let's keep an eye on that. And then, you watch him again, and he's the type of guy that slowly creeps up your list. I think you have to be careful, especially early in the year, of over-evaluating. I think the first month and a half of the OHL season, you've got guys away at pro camps. The results that you see are sometimes a little bit not characteristic of what's going to carry over through the course of the year. I mean, a guy like Ilya Soloviev was leading the OHL in scoring for the first month and a bit as a defenseman import in Saginaw, and then the second half of the year, his production declined rapidly. Cole Perfetti was quite cold at the start of the year. He couldn't buy a goal, and then he ends up at where he is at the end of the year as one of the top scorers in the OHL. So those hot starts and those cold starts, you can't react too much to. I think you have to be careful about moving guys up and down really early on. But the more you see them, I think you continue to adjust your list, and then things sort of fall into place later in the year.
Speaking of lists, you had you recently released your big long 2020 NHL draft eligible prospect list, along with some great contributions from members of Prospect Twitter that we mentioned before. And you had Quinton Byfield number one, and I definitely agree with that. I had the chance to see Quinton with play in Sudbury and the World Junior Camp, and this is a guy that brings just natural size, and he has that ability to glide on the ice, and just some great skills. But we've seen how a guy like Tim Stützle in Germany, and there's this great debate, Stützle or Byfield, and we're comparing those two guys. And I'm just sort of curious for you in your assessment with Byfield, because look, I mean, he didn't, he may have struggled at the World Juniors, but again, it's a small sample size. And the fact that, the skills that he has in his arsenal, I think he'll definitely help, an NHL team.
Yeah, I think, and it's something that I've mentioned a lot on my site and for McKean's, and that is Quinton Byfield. You're not drafting him for the player that he is right now. I think without question, he struggled at the World Juniors, and he wasn't great in the second half for Sudbury either. He had that wrist injury, and I wonder how long that was sort of hampering him, maybe even, at the World Juniors themselves. And I think his confidence had decreased a little bit in the second half as well. I don't think the World Juniors was great for that. But at the end of the day, you're looking at a kid, like you said, who has pretty much everything that you could check off. Size, skating ability, skill, patience, creativity. I mean, you name it, he has it. And just that package is so tantalizing. If he can put it together, he's going to be one of the best players in the NHL. And I mean, even if he doesn't, he's still athletic enough and skilled enough that he should still be able to be a top six forward. Maybe not the type of play driver that you anticipate or hope that he can become, but I think because of all the things that he has and all those boxes that he checks off, he's a pretty safe player on top of possessing such a high upside, because he is actually relatively young for the draft. And people are so quick to analyze through the World Juniors because it's such a big spectacle, right? We look at Alexei Lafreniere last year. He was a bit player for Team Canada. He struggled. He wasn't great, and that event can be very difficult for certain players. You look at a kid like Tim Stützle. He goes over to the World Juniors. He is Team Germany, right? There's less pressure for him to perform as well, because while Germany is hoping to avoid relegation and hoping to perform well, they're an underdog, right? So there's less pressure on him. Whereas the Canadian kids, and to some degree certain other nations as well, the tournament itself is so hyped, and there's so much pressure on these kids to perform, and the rosters are so deep. It's very difficult for them to crack not only the roster at that young age, but to make an impact. I mean, you look down the list at the kids who made the roster as a draft eligible player as an 18-year-old, and very few of them, especially for Canada, made a really large impact. But then why, knowing that, why do we over-evaluate the tournament? I think that you can use the tournament for sure, but in my personal opinion, when you're looking at young players, especially those draft eligible players, and they go into that tournament, as double underagers,
Mhm.
I don't think a bad performance can lower their draft ranking. Or I don't think it should lower their draft ranking. I think a good performance can increase it, like a guy like Stutzlo, right? You perform well, it's great. But if you don't, there's so many other things to look at. And I think a guy like Yaroslav Askarov, the Russian goaltender, is another one where he didn't have a great World Juniors, and there are a lot of people that are doubting whether he should be the top 10 pick, because goalies, everybody's got a different opinion of whether they should go high. I think we just need to be careful that we don't write a player off based on a poor performance in a draft eligible year where they're playing with players a couple years older than them, not only players but the best players in the world in those age groups. And Alexei Lafreniere is a perfect example of what a difference 1 year can make, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about going from being a bit player and somebody who struggled 1 year to being probably the best player in the tournament the following year. So you have to be careful.
No doubt. And I think it's easy for people on Twitter to have, a knee-jerk reaction, like, oh, bad tournament from Byfield. He's not, why are we rating him this high? And it's, not, and it just creates a lot of unnecessary noise. And I just think, your point is so true. Like, just take a look at the facts. Like, there's very few young players, underage players that like really make, an impact at the World Junior. And like they, and once you get to, your second year, you then become, a different player. Like, I mean, look, Connor McDavid was, special, but like from 1 year to the next, like he was really, he made that big jump. And so it's, yeah, like I just think again, like, you can't just get sucked into, while the World Juniors is a great event to show off your skill and to see what you can do under that pressure. It's still so early in a player's development that like it's not going to make or break whether or not they can have a successful year or a successful career in the NHL.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. You have to look at all the pieces of the puzzle and not just one. You have to look at, when you're evaluating somebody like Byfield, you have to look at how he played in the OHL and how he played at the Hlinka Gretzky that happened in the summer, and you have to look at all the other different pieces and then put it together. And if you still have some question marks based on those, I mean, sure, then that's your opinion as an evaluator. But if you just look at one tournament, and I know it's tough, right? The general public, who is especially this time of the year, extremely hungry for information about draft prospects, for their favorite team, especially as the lottery, is approaching. There's a lot of hunger for that information. So they're watching the World Juniors in December and remembering, oh man, yeah, that guy Quinton Byfield, he didn't play very well. He must not be very good. Yet, have they watched him in Sudbury? Did they watch him at the Hlinka, right? And that goes for a lot of other players as well. You have to be careful. And you look at the list of players who've struggled with the World Juniors that are gone on to become really good NHL players. I mean, it's quite long. Just the same, you look at the list of players who've done really well at the World Juniors and then haven't really become NHL players. I mean, that list exists as well. So again, a lot of different pieces of the puzzle.
Who's a sleeper in the 2020 draft that you have your eye on, Brock?
From the OHL, that's a good question. I think I'll give you two. The first would be Ryan O'Rourke. I think a lot of people sort of tend to miss him. He's not the flashiest player in the world. I think NHL.com just released their list of the top 10 defensemen available this year, and he wasn't on it. And that kind of shocked me because there were some guys on there that I was like, okay, Damon Hunt is on there and Helge Grond is on there. And these are guys that are more looking in that second round range, but O'Rourke wasn't. And I've heard and talked to a lot of people who do have him in that late first round range because I think he's going to play in the NHL. What degree that's going to be at, I think remains to be seen. I think it depends on, how he continues to evolve as an offensive player. But you're looking at a kid who is already a captain in the OHL as a draft eligible player and not a late birthday. We're talking about a kid in his 18-year-old season, and he's already a captain. And he plays the game hard. He's got a lot of different components to his game that make it easy to see him being a long-time NHL defenseman. I think he's a guy that's probably going to go in that late first round, early second round range, and yet we tend to sort of bypass him for guys like Keegan Gooley and Braden Schneider, and even Justin Barron, because maybe they're a little bit bigger, maybe they're a little bit more athletic. So they're that sort of, for lack of a better term, that sexier pick, right? That player who is a little bit flashier, who has sort of that explosiveness to their game, but maybe isn't quite as effective as a guy like O'Rourke. The second name I'll throw out there would be Zaid Wisdom. I mentioned him earlier, and I think this is a highly, highly motivated kid. If you read about his journey, Scott Wheeler did a really good article on it. I think it was probably just around January or February. I can't remember the exact date of The Athletic, talking about how the difficult trials and tribulations he's had moving up through the hockey system, and and not having enough money to play, and just all the things that he sacrificed and all the things his family sacrificed to get him where he is. And this is a kid that improved a ton this year, brings a lot of different things to the table, really played well with Shane Wright in Kingston this year. And I think that some people are quick to sort of write off his offensive production because he played with Wright, but ask a guy like Connor McDavid and the Oilers how hard it is to find players to play with high-end players. That's a skill in itself, is being able to work within the confines of their game, and Wisdom does that perfectly. And I think that he's starting to sort of move up draft lists later in the year, even with no hockey being played. I think the more people watch sort of Kingston's videos and watch some of those games and relook at their notes and talk to other people who've seen a lot of OHL and a lot of Kingston, and they'll tell you how much they love the kid. And he's starting to move sort of into that third round range, and even in that late second round range. And I think that's a pretty good place for him, because I do see him being an NHL player in some capacity.
I want to end the conversation by talking about, obviously, we are in a pandemic, and, who knows when, junior hockey will come back. But, young journalists, like yourself back in the day, went and, got to be able to cover OHL games because they were just very passionate about it. And, then turn it into, a side, gig like yourself, or some, go into, full on media. But I'm just curious, Brock, what advice you would have for someone, who's passionate about hockey, wants to get into, scouting and writing about hockey prospects.
I think the advice would sort of be twofold. The first would be, don't be afraid to ask and put yourself out there. Mm-hmm. If you ask and you don't get a response, don't take it as the end of the world. Continue to ask different people. Eventually people will respond to you, and eventually you'll be able to make those connections that you need to sort of help you in this industry. So don't be afraid to put yourself out there. I think that's number one. Number two, find a way to get your voice heard, be it on Twitter, be it starting a blog, be it starting a website, be it sending applications to various other outlets, like McKean's, like myself, or Teacher Considerations, or other people who are looking for people to cover a different region for them. That way your voice is being heard, and people are reading your stuff, and you're sort of developing a following, for lack of a better word. And not only that, but it's going to help you improve as well, because the more you evaluate and the more you write, the better you get at it. So I think those would be the two sort of pieces of advice that I give. Is one, don't be afraid to reach out to people, and two, make sure that you're finding an outlet for your voice to be heard and for your passion to be heard.
Yeah, I mean, two great points of advice. I think, I'll just throw in just being, sometimes being patient. I think building a following, developing credibility and establishing that brand, may take some time, but if you're dedicated at that, and you're willing to, put in the work to learn, to get better, to take in a lot of, content and what people are saying and rely on that and, develop your, style, I think you'll then, ensure that you can have a place in, in the hockey prospects world to have a real following and brand.
I think you also made a really good point there as well, and I think that's finding a focus. I think trying not to do too much is another thing that sometimes I see some of the younger generation in hockey Twitter or prospects Twitter or whatever you want to call it. I think they're trying to do too much, and I think if you were to narrow your focus, be it one region and doing it extremely well, I think that's a really good way to sort of build your following and show that you have what it takes to do this as a career or to do this as a side project or to continue to do this moving forward. I think that's another piece of advice that's really good is to really finding something that you do well and continuing to build on that instead of trying to put yourself in all these different lanes and not doing them their justice.
Final question, Brock. It's never too early to talk about 2021. Is there one player you're looking forward to watching next season if the OHL gets back to action on the ice?
If we're talking draft eligible, it's got to be Brandt Clark, defenseman for Barrie. I think he's complete package. I think he's got a chance to push for first overall. I think there's a big sort of group of players, especially defensemen, that we're seeing sort of at the top of a lot of draft boards for 2021. I think that after the Barrie coaching change this year, his game really took off, especially as he started to give him some power play time later in the year. And I think that defensively, I think he was the best 16-year-old defenseman in terms of his own end and his ability in playing a defensive game. I think he was the best since Aaron Ekblad that I've seen. And it makes sense coming from that Don Mills program, which was so, efficient. I think that team could have probably beat some OHL teams in itself. But that's another argument. Brandt Clark would be the draft eligible kid that I'm definitely the most excited to see play this year. And I really think that he's going to push his way up, into the top 3 of draft boards next June when we have a real draft, hopefully.
Fingers crossed, Brock. Anyway, Brock Otten, he's the man behind OHL Prospects. He's a contributor to McKeen's Hockey. Make sure to check him out on Twitter if you're all interested in hockey prospects. He does a great job. Brock, thanks so much for joining me today on the Weesports Quarantine Chronicles.
My pleasure.